Ladies and gentlemen, very seldom has an entire academic discipline got it so wrong as academic criminologists did when they attempted to suggest to the world in the late 1980s and early 1990s that crime was on an inexorable rise. My discussion today is an attempt by someone who studied criminology at advanced level at the University of Oxford as part of my BCL, to explain why academic criminologists got it so wrong. That doesn't mean to say I have the answers. You may find by the end of it that all I've done is provide you with even more questions. This, however, the mystery of declining crime rates, is a real puzzler for Sherlock, which is why we've got newspaper headlines that suggest that Moriarty wins the lottery and that the dog barks all night. To a degree, what I am doing is inspired by the work of Steven Pinker. However, it's very important at this point to make it clear the distinction between my work and Steven Pinker's work. This graph is one of Pinker's graphs. It is from a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which you really all ought to read, even though it's 900 pages long. What Pinker documents is how, in the countries that became the developed world, over a very lengthy period of time, going back to the Middle Ages and sometimes even antiquity when you can get data, violent crime dropped away. It became lower and lower over time. We became a less violent, less murderous society. What I'm interested in is this little bit here, where Pinker very cleverly has stopped his graph in 1991, or before 1991, in about 1985, when crime had really kicked up. And it looked like we were going to return to the levels, if this kept going in this direction, that we'd start seeing, we thought we'd abandoned in the medieval period. I am focusing on this little bit here. That's all I do. And like Steven Pinker, I have to beat you over the head with a great deal of numbers to show how much better it is to live now than in 1991, particularly in the United States when crime rates were at their highest. The city that became emblematic of all of this was New York City. How does Rudy Giuliani get ridiculously popular? During his time as mayor, he presides over a drop in violent crime, this is homicide, that looks like that. And all sorts of theories were advanced as to why crime dropped so dramatically. And Rudy Giuliani would have really liked to have said, well, aren't we wonderful in New York City? But it wasn't just New York City. This is the United Kingdom. And very thankfully to Peter Whelan, he reminded me of something very important in this graph by giving me some paperwork before this talk, which unfortunately it meant I read through some of the Economist session earlier, but it was a good reminder, is that there's different ways of measuring crime. And typically it falls into two broad categories. People rely on police reports, or they rely on panel data and survey data. What you see here are police reports. The black ones are the overlap between the two, and the grey lines are when we have used new counting rules in the UK pursuant to a series of documents that are generally known by the name British Crime Survey. Now, why do you see the movement away from police data? Because police tell lies. And the problem is you can't control for their lies because they tell two different kinds of lie. They either exaggerate crime so they can get more resources, or they underplay crime to make themselves look good. So what you have to do is finish up relying on survey data where people reasonably honestly, although not perfectly, do disclose how much crime they experienced. The survey data is also important for capturing underreported crimes, particularly sexual offences. The crime is dropping in the United States. This is aggregate data over 15 years. 2010, 2010 to 2006, 2010 to 2001. You will note that they've included an acquisitive crime in there, motor vehicle theft. In in with all these violent crimes. And you'll note that the acquisitive crime motor vehicle theft has really crashed. It's important to note at this point that the principal reason that motor vehicle crime has crashed so dramatically all around the world is it's just much harder to nick cars now. Engine immobilisers and other technologies just make it really difficult. You can't just rock out and hotwire it. I used to know how to hotwire a car. I mean, this is really quite worrying. I'm a lawyer now and I used to know how to do this. There's no way known I could do anything like starting a car that's had a proper engine immobiliser. And across the world, even including the developing world, violence, crime, particularly homicide, is in decline. This is incredible, it seems. Academic criminologists who are predicting the rise of the super predator, a young man without conscience and without virtue, who would make our cities' streets run with blood, whilst we cowered in our gated communities and hoped that our cars wouldn't be nicked and we wouldn't be beaten over the head with cricket bats. The crime rate dropped away. So where did they go? It's a very, very important question. And the reason it's an important question is because people persist in thinking like this. Asked during the previous year if there were more crime now than there were a year ago, most people, even at the height of optimism around the millennium, say, look, there's more crime, the world is getting worse. We're all going to be, to bring up a point that was made in one of the earlier panels on libertarianism and children, we're all terrified of pedophiles and we all think there's one next door. It's actually not true. So, where have all the criminals gone? Having utterly embarrassed themselves with a lot of very, very, very bad speculation about why crime was going to go up, academic criminologists started to turn to to a profession that's better with numbers, economists, and started getting information from them. And these are a selection, but by no means all, of the available theories as to why there has been a decline in crime. This is the one that Giuliani liked to ascribe it to, and there is some evidence for that for certain types of policing. There is a great deal of evidence that if you have more police, you reduce crime. It seems fairly obvious, but lots of people didn't believe it. But it does mean you finish up with societies that are extraordinarily over-policed. And Peter's documentation that he gave me earlier talked about it in Australia, but it is a global phenomenon, not just here. I'm not going to address all of these. You'd be here all day, you'd be bored rigid, and you'd have statistics falling out of the back of your head. But I'm going to give a bit of coverage to a few of them, and try to achieve two goals. One, to show how the profession of criminology attempted to fix up a terrible mess, and allied to that, the danger when an academic discipline separates itself too much from practice, in this case law enforcement and legal practice. And two, to introduce you to some thinking that is very common amongst lawyers and might make it easier, if you're aware that that's how lawyers think, to modify your arguments as classical liberals and recognise when there are certain cases that if you make them to a lawyer, there's just going to be a blank. Because lawyers think about the world like lawyers, not like normal people. We turn to the first and probably best documented, best supported in terms of evidence, reason for the decline in crime. Locking people up. Many people who are older in this room will remember how during the 1960s and the 1970s there was a very rapid change in our criminal justice systems. Even very serious criminals were often not locked up for as long as they had been historically, and the other thing that happened is that the death penalty was either abolished or there was a moratorium across the world. Many US states engaged in this activity for quite a few years where there was no further executions. Now, Stephen Pinker in The Blank Slate recognised that this was a serious problem. He showed that the evidence linking increased punishment with lower crime rates is in fact very strong. And he also showed that harsh prison terms both deter for the would-be criminal on the street, and they are a prophylactic for the would-be criminal who is already locked up. This is known as the incapacitation effect. However, because many criminologists, in a characteristic that Jonathan Haidt observed, are all from the same political persuasion, that is, they're liberal left, they were engaged in an activity of denial when it comes to these facts. It basically meant that they were arguing, or attempting to argue, that this couldn't possibly be true. And there was a very famous paper published in 1977 that I had to read while I was studying criminology, called A Moratorium on Prison Construction. The core finding of this paper was that crime tends to be high in areas where imprisonment rates are high, and the author concluded that crime would fall if imprisonment rates could only be lowered. Yes, all the economists in here are laughing, but for the non-economists, I'm going to make a cricket joke. The argument rests on a fundamental confusion of correlation and causality. Consider a parallel argument. A banana republic whose Prime Minister observes that his citizens celebrate wildly when their team wins the Cricket World Cup. He is intrigued by this correlation, but like the moratorium author, he gets the links. He fails to see the direction in which the correlation runs and gets it all exactly backwards. That means 4 years later, he decrees that his country's citizens must start celebrating the Cricket World Cup before a ball is even bowled. This, in his confused mind, will ensure victory. Very, very stupid. Extraordinarily, harsh prison terms are a greater deterrent than the death penalty. But they are a greater deterrent than the death penalty because we are fair. The death penalty only deters if it is carried out swiftly, i.e. crime, sentence, execution, often within weeks. However, you finish up with a very serious diminution in the quality of justice if you do that, which is why in the United States prisoners spend years on death row, because everyone is absolutely terrified that they might kill someone by mistake, and unfortunately, they have. Prison, however, has a terrible cost. It's more expensive to leave someone in a maximum security prison for a year than it is to send somebody to Harvard Law School. Harvard is not a cheap university. So it's expensive and it's socially destructive. People who are not locked up for life or for very long terms spend a few years in jail and are effectively rendered unemployable. Now, one of the reasons why prison is so socially destructive, particularly in the United States, and I realise I'm preaching to the choir, but it needs to be said, these are 2012 statistics. It's getting less bad in the US now because they're starting to realise that it's an extraordinarily stupid, wasteful, expensive thing to do. You're also starting to get quite pervasive jury nullification, and you're starting to get widespread electoral revolt at the costs of the war on drugs. One drug arrest every 21 seconds in the US at the end of 2012. Hold that thought. So what could you do to get the positive effects of prison, the incapacitation effect, without it costing an arm and a leg? You abandon the war on drugs. Now, this data set is from New York City, and I will draw your attention to the fact that I did a very naughty thing when I was putting these together. The ones I've made myself all start at 0, but I use somebody else's here and it starts at 400. You need to understand that this is still a very, very high incarceration rate, but it is much, much lower than the average across the rest of the United States. And it has fallen in New York as a result of a deliberate decision to put drug users and most drug offenders into diversion programs rather than sending them to prison. So that's the effect of giving up the war on drugs. In Europe, where countries have really given up on fighting the war on drugs, you have prisons that are closing for want of prisoners, and angry prison unions going, hang on, we need more prisoners or we're all going to get the sack. So, quite extraordinary. prison. Let's move now to abortion. And I'm going to let economist Stephen Levitt speak for himself. And then I'm going to make 2 points after he's spoken for himself. But before I play his little piece, this illustrates very beautifully why people sometimes want to throw rocks at economists.
You've been given a great gift, George. A chance to see what the world would be like without you.
What I believe to be true, and I think evidence supports it, is a hypothesis which many people find jarring and disturbing, but nonetheless I believe is probably right.
Good evening. In a landmark ruling, the Supreme Court today legalized abortions.
In 1973, in a case called Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court ruled that abortion, which had previously been legal in only 5 U.S. states, would now be legal nationwide. Precisely the opposite of what happened in Romania.
The legalization of abortion in the 1970s was one of the primary reasons why crime fell in the 1990s, because a whole generation of potentially unwanted children were never born because of the legalization of abortion. And if you fast forward 20 years to the point in time when they were going to be at their peak crime ages, they simply weren't there to do the crime.
You see, George, you really had a wonderful life. Don't you see what a mistake it would be to throw it away?
The trouble, of course, is that life isn't like the movies. For so many children who, without Roe v. Wade, would have been born in 1973, their lives might not have been the wonderful lives of being born into a loving family in yesterday's small-town America. Rather, theirs would be the far harder road of being born into a potentially unwanted household in America's crumbling inner cities or forsaken heartland. Levitt's conclusion, as much as half of the 1990s crime drop was an unintended consequence of Roe v. Wade.
The theory behind it is actually quite simple. Unwanted children have been shown to be at high risk for crime. With legalized abortion, fewer unwanted children were born. Therefore, the theory would be that there would be less crime 15 to 20 years later when those cohorts reach the peak crime ages. And the data support that hypothesis quite strongly. If you follow the data, there were 5 states that legalized abortion 3 years before Roe versus Wade, and about 15 years later, their crime begins to fall 3 years before the rest of the country. Then, if you look at the states where abortion was not just legal, but easily available to people who wanted to get them, 16, 17 years after Roe versus Wade, you see a 30% difference between the states doing a lot of abortions and the ones who are doing very few. Finally, all of the effect we see in the divergence in crime, all of that is concentrated among people under the age of 25, people young enough to have been exposed to legalized abortion. People older than the age of 25, there's no difference whatsoever between the high abortion states and the low abortion states. And I think in some ways that's the best evidence we have that legalized abortion is responsible for a big chunk of the decline in crime.
Levitt's controversial theory has provoked strong reaction among critics. Is he, for example, advocating abortion as a crime-fighting tool?
In no way would I take this as advocacy in favor of legalized abortion. I don't think anyone's opinion about whether abortion should be legal or not should be affected by our results.
Some of Levitt's critics suggest that his theory holds what might appear to be class or racial implications. He argues, though, that race and class have nothing to do with the matter, that his theory targets no specific group other than mothers-to-be of all backgrounds. And since, as Levitt points out, women who elect to abort go on to become childbearers consistent with the general population, Levitt's argument could thus be understood to suggest that legalized abortion does not so much prevent births as delay it. This turns an unwanted birth by a too young mother, for example, into a wanted birth by that mother when she feels more ready. So, if Levitt is not advocating abortion as a crime-fighting tool, what is he advocating? Well, whether one is pro-life or pro-choice or somewhere in between, there's a meaningful and to date unimpeached connection between giving women the right to choose and a reduction in crime.
And you'll note it finishes on images from Grand Theft Auto, Scotland's possibly most famous export, even ahead of Lefroy and Glenfiddich. Before I come, however, to Grand Theft Auto, I'm going to do two things. One, introduce you to a little bit of legal reasoning. And I'm going to apply it to abortion because it gives you an idea why commonly libertarian, moral, absolute arguments don't work very well and they don't work well with lawyers. And two, I'm then going to make a cultural explanation as to why Levitt's data seems to hold in the United States. No one has ever really been able to punch a very effective hold on it. Steven Pinker tried, and he fails. But it doesn't hold in Britain. In fact, there is no relationship at all. First, the legal argument. Lawyers often speak in terms of scales of damages. If someone is injured, physically, their body has to be valued, the injured part. How much for a dominant hand? How much for a non-dominant hand? How much for a foot, or an eye, or an ear? It sounds very cruel, and it sounds quite callous. It's called quantum of damages, or assessing quantum. And when you're a green young barrister, it's pretty much the only job you do. Quantum. And sentencing. Submissions on sentence. But I got lots of quantum. There was a period there where I had the formula for compound interest blue tacked to my wall in Chambers. So, if a hand or an eye or an ear are worth differential values, so too are people. Some people are worth more than others, and indeed this is exactly how damages awards are made. That's why some people get much bigger damage awards than others. They have greater earning potential, so the court has to draw fine distinctions. Hold that thought. Some people hold what I consider to be an intermediate pro-choice position. They do not believe that a fetus is the one-to-one equivalent of a newborn, but also do not believe that a fetus has no relative value at all, 1 to 0. These are the extreme pro-life and pro-choice positions. Now imagine that I get to force this group to play the lawyer's quantum of damages game and assign a value to fetuses. And say, because it's a thought experiment, that the relative value that I force them to affix based on scales of damages is that one newborn or one adult equals 100 fetuses, so 1 to 100. I'm doing this for a reason. Bear with me. There are roughly 1.5 million abortions in the United States every year. For a person who thinks one newborn equals 100 fetuses, those 1.5 million abortions translate, dividing 1.5 million by 100, into the equivalent of the loss of 15,000 human lives. That is, incidentally, the murder rate in the United States per year. Hold that thought. Now, also, please do not throw rocks at lawyers. I mean, people like to throw rocks at economists, but you can also throw rocks at lawyers for thinking in that way. Now, I always used to think, when I was young, that cultural explanations were the last resort of the analytically bereft. However, I knew, when I read Levitt and Donohue's original paper, that whilst their data seemed to be very good for the United States, and I went and redid it all myself because it was such a terrifying thought, it's almost eugenic thought, I knew it wasn't true for Britain. Abortion was legalised in Britain in 1967. Crime did not start to drop in the United Kingdom until 1995, which means abortion had a different effect in America from what it did in the United Kingdom. Why? I have a theory. It is only a theory. It is, however, a testable hypothesis. Somebody should go away and do some research. This is my theory. Poor people in America have abortions at much higher rates than middle-class people. Poor blacks manage to combine both extraordinary hypocrisy, they are the most religious group in the population and most opposed to abortion, but they have the highest rates of abortions, with you've got extraordinary hypocrisy going on there. However, in Europe and the UK, the abortion rates, based when you strip out the social class figures, show no real difference between the rich, the poor and the middle class. My theory is it is because Europe and Great Britain have more generous welfare states. Abortion rates are generally lower in the United Kingdom and Western Europe than they are in the US, even in regimes where they are extremely liberal. More liberal than in the UK, where you can just walk in off the street and you've got socialised medicine and it doesn't cost anything. So, pay welfare checks, less abortions, more single motherhood, more crime theories. So, we come now to Grand Theft Auto, and the fairly compelling evidence that if you give people the opportunity to access pornography and to play violent video games, they get all their cathartic release that way and don't commit crimes in real life. Now, obviously, I can't do any sexy images for pornography because otherwise I would probably get thrown out of this building and it would get back to Scotland and it would get back to England and Wales and I would lose my practicing certificate and I would be carpeted and the partners would be saying, please explain. This, however, is just 2 studies, but this has been repeated over and over and over again. There is no link between porn and misogyny. There is no link between objectification and diminished views of women. I'm sorry, there are a lot of feminists out there who would dearly like to prove that this is the case. They have got absolutely nowhere. Now, the proper name is the pornography respect axis, which is what I have put on the head of the slide. However, one of my criminology tutors at Oxford, and I won't drop her in it, used to call it the Lech liberty axis. And she put it like this. Scholars have long noted that societies that paint what we call pornography all over their walls and use it to decorate their temples tend to accord women higher status than societies that A, demand women be depicted in a certain way, or B, demand that they dress modestly. Despite the fact that one view is associated with feminism and the other with monotheistic conservatism, the 2 attitudes have a well-documented link. Now, I can't be funny with the porn ones because it would get me into trouble, but I can be funny with Grand Theft Auto. So, this unfortunately only gets as far as Grand Theft Auto 3, and once again I have to, in the interest of disclosure, point out that it doesn't start at 0. Department of Justice in the States should know better than this. And it also collapses that extraordinary reduction in property crime into violent crime, which makes this steeper than it otherwise would be if it were just violent crime. Now, it's still very steep. So people start playing lots of video games, and video games that are supposed to give them ideas about making cars. And they stop making cars. We should all go and write to their head office in Edinburgh and thank the nice people at Rockstar Games.
Or nick their car.
Or nick their car. They probably have a good car too. Now, jokes aside, let's do something a little bit more serious. This graph maps, and this was actually generated in the wake of the Sandy Hook shooting, where a lot of very silly speculative things were said by a lot of organisations who really should know better about both guns and video games. This graph maps the per capita spending on video games in the top 10 national markets on one axis, and the per capita gun-related murders in those countries on the other. Far from showing a strong link between the 2 statistics, the graph actually shows a small negative correlation. As video game spending goes up, gun-related murders tend to go down. While it's true that in the United States, inevitably the statistical outlier, is the biggest single market for video games in the world and also accounts for more gun-related murders than the other industrialised countries, much of that has to do with the sheer size of its population. When accounting for the number of people, nearby Canada actually spends slightly more on video games and the same amount of money on guns, yet has less than 1/6 the per capita rate of gun-related murders. The Netherlands, whose citizens, they're right out here, whose citizens each spend nearly twice as much as the US on video games, have even lower gun violence rates. Now, some people might like to argue that that's because in the Netherlands they have strict gun laws. However, Canada doesn't have particularly strict gun laws. It's relatively easy to get a weapon in Canada. So what does that mean? That means the next time someone tries to tell you that a combination of guns and violent video games are turning the youth into remorseless killers, you can answer them with 2 words put to music. Explain Canada! Explain Canada! Okay, stop up. Now, what I'm going to do is attempt to explain the cognitive error engaged in by those who have linked both freely available pornography and violent video games to crime. When it comes to feminists, I'm going to get out on a limb here and suggest that this is probably the most misguided large-scale campaign on behalf of the women's movement since early feminists in the United States backed prohibition. Now, this is British data. This is from YouGov, British Polling Organisation. Thank you, David, a friend of mine, who got this for me. What I want to show you is that the cognitive error when it comes to pornography also exists amongst women with video games, and you get an extraordinary exercise in cognitive dissonance here. You can't hold this one, video and computer games are a cause of violence, in your head, at the same time as having almost, I mean this is in the margin of error, almost the same attitudes as men when you suggest that video and computer games are a useful outlet for frustrations and aggression. This is mad. How can we do this at the same time? It's complete cognitive dissonance. Now, I'm not a scientist. Hello, lawyer. Someone like Steven Pinker will try to explain why this is using a great deal of scientific data and scientific papers, many of which just go straight over my head. I do, however, work in corporate law, and I've got a reasonably good understanding of economics and finance as a result. So I'm going to explain what I think the error is. I'm going to do it like this. Feminists have managed, and social conservatives have managed to confuse substitute goods and complementary goods. Lots of people really like Coca-Cola. They're not perfect substitutes. They'll trade an awful lot of Pepsi for a little bit of Coca-Cola. But the point is, one can be swapped out for the other. Standard first-year microeconomics, I think we've probably all seen this in our textbooks. Contrast the boots and laces and ink cartridges and printers of complementary goods. You can't have one without the other. What has happened is that feminists and social conservatives have argued that sexual and other violence goes together with sexual imagery and violent play. It doesn't. As people get more of the latter more cheaply, they want less of the former. We are dealing with substitutes, not complements. That is the economic argument for what is going on. I don't have the scientific background to explain the science behind it, but that is the source of the cognitive error. Thank you, Taya, who reminded me of this before the presentation. This has been in the news quite a bit lately and all over the BBC. Lead, or tetraethyl lead, the stuff that they used to use for just about everything. I have to do one of my little exercises in the past as a foreign country, when lead was considered this absolutely wonderful thing that was wonderful for your high-performance engine, that stopped all the knocking and pinging and stopped planes falling out of the sky, and meant that you could, you know, if you added extra lead, you had go faster petrol. It was patented and made this company an absolute fortune. And it wasn't just this stuff. It was in paint. Who here can remember how smelly it used to be to paint the inside of your house? Because it was lead-based paint. Who here can remember Hollywood movies, and to this day Bollywood movies, where the women's makeup seems to be so wonderfully smooth and clearly defined and never runs? Lead. It was everywhere, and it's really nasty stuff. Rachel Connors made some excellent points during the course of this conference about the way smoking has been overhyped as a danger. This was underhyped. This is awful stuff. It knocks the dangers of tobacco into a cocked hat. Its widespread presence makes children stupid. It makes them aggressive. It means they grow up with lower IQs. It makes them impulsive. More difficult for them to delay gratification, more difficult to apply themselves, it's more difficult to apply themselves to a task. Lead is horrible. Now, I'm going to go through the data here because you need to do a time lag exercise. You will note, if you look here, this is 1988. It's the average lead level in a preschool child's blood, and it's measured in terms of micrograms of lead per deciliter. That's what that stands for. 23 years later, 2011, you're looking at the violent crimes per 100,000 people. Unfortunately, when I made this, I only got figures up to 2011. It's since been, more figures have come out, and that crime line is dropping further. This is the United States, and at the bottom, what I've given you is, as the Centers for Disease Control in the US and other organisations across the world did the same thing, the NHS in Britain and so on and so forth, came to realise, based on more research, just how horrifically dangerous lead was, the definition of safe kept shifting. Until, and I've turned it into a little bottle here, because otherwise there's just too much information on another slide, until it finishes up being, to use, to coin a phrase, unsafe at any level. And you've even got difficulties with old houses. I mean, this is something that comes up in Edinburgh quite a lot. You've got difficulties when you're renovating beautiful old Georgian homes, and all the plaster work and all the paint work is all lead. And you have to get people, you have to finish up costing more to do it, to renovate. These are figures for American cities. Once again, now this is using natural logs. I don't want to go into how they're derived, because you'll finish up going around the twist, and I know there are real statisticians here and I might actually get it wrong. The thing to pay attention to is the shape of the curve. Okay? You look for the lead, look for the crime, look for the shape of the curve. And once again, do the same thing. These aren't natural logs, and this is done with a 19-year rather than a 23-year time lag for Britain, Canada, New Zealand and Finland. And you find the same pattern emerging. So, lead's looking pretty compelling. But abortion looked pretty compelling too, and then we discovered it's like socialism in one country, it's only true in one place. Lead seems to be truer in more places, but there still might be flaws. And finally, it's reasonably well documented that quite serious social pathologies are worse in more religious parts of the United States. Now, this isn't necessarily crime, it's social pathology, as in abortion rates are higher, teen pregnancy rates are higher, various other indicia of social exclusion are higher. Very much higher, big gaps, but those aren't crimes. The data is only suggestive as opposed to indicative when it comes to religion and crime. These quite low. More suggestive when it comes to acquisitive crime, but only suggestive. There is, however, a very strong social pathology link, particularly the teen pregnancy and the abortion rate, massively higher in the religious communities than in the non-religious ones. And that, unfortunately, though, I only have data for one country. I only have the United States. Other countries, because they're so much less religious, you actually can't really get useful information. Barna Group, they're quite a good evangelical organisation in the States that do really, really good data analysis. And once again, it's suggestive with your property crime. Okay, so what's going on there? Ah, yes, sorry, one extra slide on this. There's reasonably well documented links between poor people who are single parents and their children having worse outcomes. Middle class people who are single parents, it doesn't matter. It's a little bit socially uncool and un-PC to make the suggestion, but it would appear that one middle class parent is worth two working class ones or two poor ones. However, it doesn't lead to crime. It just means that little Johnny and little Julie don't finish college, but it doesn't turn them into murderers. So, the female-headed households and the crime rate. So when people catastrophise about this, they're being really quite silly. Now, I don't normally go for biblical explanations. I tend to like data. However, this is the best explanation for that phenomenon. What is going on here? Why is it that the social pathology is much lower in non-religious communities? I don't need the physician. Psychologists have long documented that some individuals have a very strong inner locus of control. They are good at delaying. They are good at delaying gratification. Sorry, that's 40 minutes. They are good at delaying gratification, and they find it easier to be able to manage their own lives and choose their own path without any really unpleasant consequences. So, you've now got a situation where historically everyone had to be religious on pain of persecution. Now there is basically a natural experiment whereby people can ignore religion. It's not usually an active choice. The number of people who are active atheists is quite small because they don't need it. These are the kind of people who have your inner locus of control. However, lots of people need an external locus of control. We know this. That's why a lot of people struggle at school unless the teacher's boot is on their neck, because they're not terribly self-directed. This means people who need an external locus of control are now no longer compelled to be religious, and they have to maintain their religious beliefs by sheer dint of effort, on top of maintaining the doctrinal values of their religion. And nobody's helping them to do it anymore. There's no state imprimatur behind it. That's really quite hard. That's a tall order. So, I'm supposed to now give you the holy grail of the truth and tell you why crime declined. I can't do that. With the exception of prisons and policing, there is a general problem with all of this data. That is, problem of correlations between widely separated variables in time. The other thing that's going on here is that the parallelism in the curves for lead and time-shifted crime are almost too perfect. The crime curve should, I think, be a more attenuated, smeared version of the curve for lead. Why? 23 years after the first lower lead cohort, there were still other people with plenty of lead in their system that had the opportunity and were committing crimes. So what we must be dealing with then is not just the effect of lead on one cohort, but a general drop in crime, particularly in Britain, across as many as 10 cohorts. It can't just be explained by ageing, it can't just be explained by abortion or by lead. Something more is needed. I don't know what that something more is, but there is no doubt that you, me and everyone now live in a much safer, more orderly world with much less crime, much more social peace, and no one knows why.
Two hands up by the same person. One question only.
Just a suggestion. Could there be a link to welfare and the lower rates of crime, suggesting, for example, maybe drug addicts would be dependent on welfare to get their hit, rather than going out and committing, say, property offences?
I actually wrote a paper on, not the drug addict issue, that paper there, if you want to go to it, it's on page 30 of that symposium that I did for the Legatum Institute, the Adam Smith Institute in the UK, and that deals directly with the welfare issue, but it deals mainly with the fact that if you have a welfare state, you finish up with far fewer infant murders and lower abortion rates among the poor, but it does address some of the other issues as well. There does seem to be a link between a welfare state and lower crime, but I think it's very specific, and it's very specific to certain crimes.